They say money reveals character, but I kept my $120 million secret for over 2 decades. Living as an ordinary retired teacher in a small town, I wanted to know who would treat me with respect when they thought I had nothing to offer. On my son's wedding day, I finally got my answer, and it forced me to make a decision that would change everything. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and I've been keeping the biggest secret of my life for 23 years. At 68, I'm what most people would call unremarkable, a widow, a retired high school English teacher living in the same modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street in Mapleford that my late husband Richard and I bought 35 years ago. My neighbors know me as the woman who still tends her garden every morning, who volunteers at the local library 3 days a week, and who clips coupons from the Sunday paper like clockwork. What they don't know is that I'm worth $120 million. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October. I remember because I just finished grading a stack of essays on The Great Gatsby, my last batch before retirement. I'd stopped at Murphy's Corner store on my way home, picking up milk, bread, and on impulse, a lottery ticket. I almost never played, but something about that day made me feel lucky. Maybe it was the crisp autumn air, or the way the light filtered through the maple trees, painting everything gold. 3 days later, while having my morning coffee and reading the paper, I checked the numbers, then I checked them again and again. My hands shook so badly I had to set the mug down before I spilled coffee all over the kitchen table Richard had built with his own hands. $120 million. After taxes, it would still be more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I sat in that kitchen for hours, staring at the ticket, thinking about what this meant. Richard had been gone for only 2 years then. Cancer took him quickly, mercifully, but it left a hole in my life that felt infinite. We'd been planning our retirement together, modest travels, more time with our son Michael, maybe finally taking that pottery class we'd always joked about. Now I had all the money in the world and no one to share it with. That's when I made my decision. I wouldn't tell anyone. Not yet. I claimed the prize through a trust, keeping my name out of the papers. The lawyer who helped me set it up was from 3 states away, someone who'd never connect Eleanor Brooks, the teacher, with Eleanor Brooks, the lottery winner. The money went into accounts, investments, all carefully managed and growing quietly while I continued living exactly as I had before. I kept my part-time job at the library. I kept shopping at the same grocery store, buying the same generic brands, driving the same 15-year-old Honda Civic that Richard had maintained so carefully. I even kept the squeaky screen door he'd always promised to fix but never got around to. Why? Because I wanted to know something. I wanted to know who would value me. Just me, Eleanor Brooks, nobody special, when they thought I had nothing to offer but myself. I'd spent my whole life watching how money changed people, reading about it in the literature I taught, seeing it play out in small ways in our little town. Now I had the chance to conduct my own experiment. I told myself I'd reveal the truth when the time was right. Maybe when Michael got married, I thought I could give him and his bride a real start in life, the kind Richard and I never had. I could be the fairy godmother who makes all their dreams come true. But as the years passed, something shifted. Michael grew up, went to college, got his MBA, and landed a job at a financial firm in the city. He'd come home less and less, and when he did, he spoke in a language I barely recognized, full of leveraging assets and optimizing portfolios and networking with high-value individuals. He still called me Mom, still hugged me when he visited, but I could see the way his eyes would sweep over my little house, the way he'd suggest I upgrade things, the way he'd grow impatient when I'd talk about my library volunteers or the new book club I'd started. "You should think about selling this place," he'd say. "The market's good right now. You could get something smaller, more manageable, as if the home where I'd raised him, where his father had taught him to ride a bike in the driveway, where we'd spent countless Christmas mornings by the fireplace, was just another asset to optimize." I'd smile and change the subject, filing away these moments like evidence. The money sat in its accounts, growing quietly, waiting. And I waited too, still hoping to see glimpses of the boy who used to help me plant tomatoes in the backyard, who'd write me Mother's Day poems in crayon, who'd promised at his father's funeral that he'd always take care of me. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wonder if I was being foolish. Maybe I should have told him years ago. Maybe money would have brought us closer, not driven us apart. But then I'd remember Richard's words, spoken from his hospital bed in those final days. Make sure he remembers what really matters. Ellie, don't let him lose himself in chasing success. So I kept my secret, and I kept watching, and I kept hoping that somewhere under the suit and tie and corporate speak, my son was still there. I just needed to wait for the right moment to find out. I didn't know then that his wedding day would give me my answer, just not the one I'd spent 23 years hoping to hear. The years after Richard died were the hardest of my life. Not because of the money, that secret had become oddly comforting, like a warm coat no one else could see. It was the silence that nearly broke me. The house that had once echoed with his laughter, his off-key singing in the shower, his commentary during baseball games, now felt like a museum of our life together. I'd catch myself setting 2 coffee cups out in the morning, or buying his favorite brand of whole wheat bread at the store. The grief counselor at the church said these things were normal, that healing takes time. What she didn't know was that I had 120 million reasons to start over anywhere else, to leave these painful memories behind. But I stayed, because this was where Richard had lived, where Michael had grown up, where our real life had happened. Michael took his father's death hard, though he showed it in ways that worried me. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Dad always said education was the best investment. He'd tell me during his brief phone calls from college, but I knew Richard had meant more than just grades and degrees. He'd meant learning how to think, how to question, how to remain curious about the world. Michael seemed to have translated it into a relentless pursuit of credentials and connections. After graduation, when he landed that job at Preston and Associates in the city, he was so proud. Dad would have been thrilled, he said, showing me his offer letter. The salary was more than Richard and I had ever made combined. I smiled and told him how wonderful it was, but inside, I wondered if Richard would have been more interested in what kind of company it was, what kind of work Michael would be doing, what kind of person he'd become there. The transformation was gradual at first. New clothes, expensive suits that he'd explain were necessary for client meetings. A new car, reliable transportation is crucial in this business. Mom? New vocabulary that made our conversations feel like business transactions. He'd visit less frequently, and when he did come home, he seemed uncomfortable, checking his phone constantly, anxious to get back to his real life. You know, Mom, he said during one Thanksgiving visit, looking around our dining room, you really should consider updating this place. The wallpaper's pretty dated, and these old appliances can't be energy efficient. I served him turkey on the same china his grandmother had passed down to me, at the same oak table where he'd done his homework for 18 years, and wondered when home had become something that needed updating to meet his new standards. The distance between us grew like a slow tide. He'd remember my birthday, but with expensive gifts I didn't need or want. A designer handbag that looked absurd next to my teaching totes, a smart watch when I was perfectly happy with my old Timex. The thoughtfulness was gone, replaced by price tags, as if the cost of something could substitute for actually knowing what might bring me joy. I kept teaching part-time at the library, running my book clubs, tending my garden. I watched my investments grow quietly in the background, sometimes forgetting for days at a time that I was wealthy beyond imagination. The money had become like a test I was running, though I wasn't sure anymore who was being tested, Michael or myself. When Michael called to tell me about Vanessa, his voice was different, animated in a way I hadn't heard in years, but also nervous, like a student presenting a project he desperately wanted to impress me with. Her family's very established, he said, after telling me the basics. The Callaways. You might have heard of them. Callaway Capital Management? I hadn't, but I murmured something appropriate. She's incredible, Mom. Harvard MBA, speaks 3 languages, serves on 2 charity boards, and beautiful, of course. She's everything I've been looking for. Everything he'd been looking for. Like she was an acquisition, not a person. I wondered what had happened to the boy who'd once told me he wanted to marry someone who laughed at his jokes and liked hiking on weekends. When do I get to meet her? I asked. Soon, he promised. We'll drive up next month. I want to do this right, you know? Make a good impression. On whom? I asked. But he'd already moved on to telling me about the restaurant where they'd met, some exclusive place where you needed reservations months in advance. As I hung up the phone that night, I stood in my kitchen, Richard's in my kitchen, and looked at the lottery ticket I still kept in the drawer with the important papers. 20 years of waiting, of watching, of hoping. I'd imagined this moment so many times, Michael bringing home the woman he loved, starting a family of his own, and me finally able to share my secret, to give them the kind of start Richard and I could only have dreamed of. But something in his voice, in the way he'd described her like a business merger rather than a romance, made me hesitate. The money wasn't going anywhere. I could wait a little longer, see what kind of woman had captured my son's heart, or whatever had replaced it in that designer suit of his. I went to bed that night thinking about Richard, about what he would have made of all this. Trust your instincts, Ellie, he used to say. You can read people better than anyone I know. I hoped he was right, because something told me I was about to need every bit of insight I'd gained from 68 years of watching, waiting, and learning what really mattered in this world. The test was about to begin in earnest, and I had a feeling I wasn't going to like the results. The day Michael brought Vanessa home, I'd been up since 5:30 a.m., nervous as a schoolgirl before a test. I'd cleaned the house twice, baked Richard's mother's apple pie recipe, and changed clothes 3 times before settling on my comfortable blue cardigan and gray slacks. I wanted to look nice, but not like I was trying too hard. After all, I was just a retired teacher meeting her son's girlfriend, not someone with 9 figures sitting in investment accounts. I heard the car before I saw it, not Michael's usual BMW, but something that purred expensively as it pulled into my driveway, a white Mercedes, pristine as fresh snow, looking almost embarrassed to be parked next to my elderly Honda. Michael emerged first, and I felt my heart squeeze. He looked handsome in his casual clothes, though I noticed his casual now meant designer jeans and a polo shirt that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He came around to open Vanessa's door, and I saw her for the first time. She was beautiful in that polished way that spoke of good genes and better maintenance, blonde hair that fell in perfect waves, a cream-colored dress that whispered rather than shouted its price, shoes that had never met a sidewalk they couldn't conquer. But it was her eyes that caught me, blue and sharp, taking in everything with the kind of assessment I recognized from years of watching students size up a classroom on the first day. "Mom," Michael said, leading her up the front path, "this is Vanessa, my mother, Eleanor." "Mrs. Brooks," she said, extending a manicured hand. Her handshake was firm, professional. "Michael's told me so much about you." "All good, I hope," I said, trying for warmth. "Please, call me Eleanor. Come in, come in." I watched her eyes sweep over my living room, taking in the old furniture, the family photos covering every surface, the ancient television that still worked perfectly fine despite Michael's annual offers to buy me a new one. Her smile never wavered, but I caught the slight pause at the faded wallpaper, the quick glance at the ceiling fan that wobbled just a bit. "What a charming home," she said. "So much character. These older houses have such personality, don't they?" Older, character, personality, all euphemisms, I knew, for outdated, worn, and in need of renovation. "Thank you," I said simply. "Michael grew up here. Would you like some coffee? I've just made a fresh pot." Oh, I'd love some. Do you have almond milk by any chance and perhaps stevia? I have regular milk and sugar, I said, or cream, if you prefer. Black is fine, she said quickly, though I noticed she barely touched the cup I brought her. We sat in the living room. Vanessa perched on the edge of my sofa like she was afraid it might stain her dress. Michael seemed nervous, filling the silence with chatter about their drive up, the traffic, the weather. I watched them together, noting how he kept glancing at her for approval, how she would touch his arm when she wanted him to stop talking or change the subject. Michael tells me you were a teacher, Vanessa said, turning those assessing eyes on me. How wonderful. Education is so important, isn't it? I actually serve on the board of a charter school in the city. We're always looking for experienced educators to volunteer. That's kind of you, I said. I still volunteer at our local library. I run the reading programs there. The local library, she repeated, in the same tone she'd used for character and personality. How quaint. There's something so nostalgic about physical books, isn't there? Of course. I do all my reading on my tablet now. So much more efficient. The afternoon wore on like that, death by 1,000 small cuts. Every topic of conversation became an opportunity for Vanessa to demonstrate how much more sophisticated her world was than mine. My garden was sweet, but had I considered Japanese landscaping? My apple pie was delicious, but had I tried the gluten-free, sugar-free version from that bakery in Soho? My book club sounded fun, but had I heard about the literary salon she attended, where they only discussed Booker Prize winners? Michael said little, occasionally jumping in to explain or contextualize something about our life, as if he were a translator helping Vanessa understand a foreign culture. When I showed them his old room, still decorated with his high school trophies and college pennants, he actually looked embarrassed. I keep meaning to help Mom clear this stuff out, he said to Vanessa. Make it into a proper guest room. It is a proper guest room, I said quietly, for my son, whenever he wants to come home. Vanessa smiled that polished smile. Of course. How sentimental. By the time they left, I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with playing hostess. I stood at the window, watching the Mercedes glide away, taking my son back to a world where my home was charming and my life was quaint. I thought about the millions sitting in those accounts, how easily I could buy a house that would meet Vanessa Calloway's standards, how quickly I could transform myself into someone she'd have to respect. But that would defeat the entire purpose, wouldn't it? The point was to be loved and valued as I was, not as I could be with unlimited funds. Still, as I cleared away the barely touched coffee cups and wrapped up the leftover pie Michael had been too sophisticated to take home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd already lost something I couldn't buy back at any price. My son had brought home a woman who looked at me like I was a relic, a problem to be managed, a phase of Michael's life that needed updating. And worse, much worse, was that he seemed to agree with her. 3 weeks after that first meeting, Michael called with an invitation. Vanessa's parents want to meet you, he said, his voice carrying that same nervous energy I'd noticed before. They're having a dinner party this Saturday. Nothing too formal, just family and a few close friends. Nothing too formal at the Calloway estate turned out to be white-gloved servers, a 5-course meal, and enough silverware at each place setting to stock my entire kitchen drawer. The house, I couldn't call it a home, was a monument to wealth. All marble floors and crystal chandeliers and art that probably cost more than most people's retirement funds. I'd agonized over what to wear, finally settling on my best dress, the navy one I'd bought for Michael's college graduation. It was well made and classic, but standing in the Calloway's foyer, I felt like a sparrow among peacocks. Other guests glided past in designer clothing, their jewelry catching the light from those enormous chandeliers. Eleanor, Vanessa appeared at my elbow, looking effortless in a black cocktail dress. So glad you could make it. Come, let me introduce you to Mummy and Daddy. Mummy and Daddy, at her age. Charles and Meredith Calloway were exactly what I'd expected. Tall, Elegant, with the kind of posture that came from never having to bend to anyone or anything, Charles had silver hair and a handshake that managed to be both firm and dismissive. Meredith's smile was Vanessa's, practiced in measuring. "So you're Michael's mother," Meredith said, as if this were something that required confirmation. "How lovely to finally meet you. Michael's such a bright young man. You must be so proud." "I am," I said simply. "And you were a teacher, I understand," Charles added, in the tone one might use to say, "And you were a circus performer?" "High school English, for 35 years. "How dedicated," Meredith murmured. "Such important work, shaping young minds, though I imagine it must have been challenging, especially in public schools. We've always believed in private education ourselves." Vanessa attended Exeter. Of course. Of course. The evening progressed in painful increments. I was introduced to various guests as Michael's mother, the teacher, as if that were my full name and title. Everyone was perfectly polite, perfectly pleasant, and perfectly clear that I was a curiosity, a quaint backstory to Michael's more impressive present. At dinner, I was seated between a woman who ran an art gallery and a man who managed hedge funds. They spoke across me for most of the meal, discussing vacation homes and investment strategies, occasionally remembering to include me with questions like, "Do you invest, Eleanor?" or "Have you been to the Hamptons?" I watched Michael throughout the evening. He was in his element here, laughing at the right moments, contributing to discussions about market trends and portfolio diversification. When someone mentioned a recent charity gala, he knew who had attended. When they discussed restaurants, he had opinions about wine pairings. This was his world now, and he wore it like a perfectly tailored suit. But what hurt most was how he introduced me. Not my mother, with warmth or pride, but my mother, Eleanor, with a slight apologetic note, as if he needed to explain my presence. When someone asked about his father, he gave the briefest possible answer. He passed away some years ago, without mentioning that Richard had been a carpenter who built beautiful things with his hands, who'd taught Michael to fish and to change a tire and to treat everyone with respect. During a lull between courses, Meredith turned to me with what she probably thought was kindness. "You know, Eleanor, you've done such a wonderful job with Michael. It can't have been easy, raising him on a teacher's salary. But look how well he's turned out. He's quite the success story." A success story, as if his life were a rags-to-riches tale, with me as the humble beginning he'd heroically overcome. "Thank you," I managed, my throat tight. "And now with the wedding to plan," she continued, "you must let us know if you need anything. We're happy to help with whatever you might need." The implication was clear. They assumed I couldn't afford to contribute, that I'd need their charity to participate in my own son's wedding. I thought of the $120 million sitting quietly in those accounts and almost laughed, or cried. I wasn't sure which. "That's very kind," I said instead. After dinner, during coffee and cognac in one of their many sitting rooms, I found myself alone on a balcony overlooking their pool. Michael found me there. "Quite a place, isn't it?" he said, standing beside me but not quite meeting my eyes. "It's very impressive," and I agreed. "Mom," he started, then stopped. "I know this is all a bit much, but Vanessa's family, they're good people. They just live differently." "Differently," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling it?" "What do you want me to say?" He sounded defensive now. "That I should apologize for being successful? For wanting more than—" He caught himself. "More than what? Michael? More than what your father and I gave you?" That's not what I meant. But it was exactly what he meant. We both knew it. Inside, I could hear laughter, the clink of expensive glassware, conversations about things that didn't matter dressed up as things that did. This was Michael's world now, where I was a footnote, a quaint story about humble beginnings, a problem to be managed with careful seating arrangements and charitable offers of help. "I should go," I said. "It's a long drive home." "I'll walk you out," he offered, but I shook my head. "Stay with your guests, your future in-laws." I made my goodbyes, thanking the Callaways for their hospitality, dodging Vanessa's air kisses, pretending not to notice the relief in everyone's eyes that the evening's charity case was departing. In my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. Through the vast windows, I could see them all, golden in the warm light, Michael at the center of it, finally where he'd always wanted to be, or where he thought he wanted to be. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of my old Honda's engine, carrying me back to my small house, my real life, my memories of a man who'd known the value of things that couldn't be bought. I thought about the money again, about whether revealing it would change anything. But I already knew the answer. It would change everything, just not in the ways that mattered. The wedding planning began in earnest 2 months later. I received my invitation to the planning brunch through Vanessa's assistant, not from my son, not from his fiancée, but from someone paid to manage their social calendar. The message was clear before I even arrived at the country club where the meeting would take place. I dressed carefully again, choosing a simple skirt suit that had served me well through years of parent-teacher conferences. The country club was exactly what I'd expected, all polished wood and hushed voices, where membership probably cost more than I'd earned in a year of teaching. Meredith Calloway was already holding court when I arrived, surrounded by what I would soon learn was the wedding planning committee, Vanessa's sister, 2 cousins, her best friend from Exeter, and someone introduced only as the consultant. I was the only representative from Michael's side. Eleanor, darling. Meredith air-kissed me in that way that avoided actual contact. So glad you could make it. We've already started discussing the venue options. The plaza is available, of course, but Vanessa has her heart set on the Rainbow Room. How nice, I said, taking the seat that was clearly meant for me at the far end of the table. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in exclusion disguised as inclusion. Every suggestion I made was met with patient smiles and explanations of why it wouldn't work. When I mentioned that Michael had always loved garden parties, Vanessa laughed. Can you imagine? An outdoor wedding in Manhattan? The noise alone. When I suggested we include some of Richard's family traditions, his mother's wedding cookies, the Celtic blessing his grandfather used to say, Meredith patted my hand. How ethnic, she said. But we're trying to keep things elegant, you understand. Ethnic, elegant, no, as if the two were mutually exclusive. But the moment that would stay with me, the moment that finally broke something inside me, came near the end of the brunch. They were discussing seating arrangements, and Meredith pulled out an elaborate chart. Now, family will be at the front tables, of course, she said, pointing to tables 1 through 5. The Calloway cousins here, business associates there, close friends from the club. I watched her organize everyone into neat categories, waiting to hear where Michael's mother would sit. She reached table 8, then 9, and I still hadn't heard my name. Where will I be seated? I finally asked. Meredith looked up, as if surprised I was still there. Oh, of course. Let's see. She scanned her chart. Yes, table 10. With the wives of Charles's business partners, we thought you'd be more comfortable there. You'll have so much in common. Table 10. In wedding geography. That was practically Siberia. I'd be seated with strangers, women I'd never met, while my only son got married at the front of the room. I'm his mother, I said quietly. Of course you are. Meredith's smile was bright and empty. And table 10 is still in the main room. You'll be able to see everything perfectly. I looked around the table at these women who were planning my son's wedding as if I were a problem to be solved rather than the person who had raised him, who had held him through fever dreams and homework struggles and the death of his father. Not one of them met my eyes. If I might make a suggestion, the consultant chimed in. We could put Eleanor at table 9 instead. It's a bit closer, and the angle for photographs would be better. They actually discussed this for 5 minutes. The angle for photographs, as if I were a prop to be positioned rather than a mother watching her only child get married. Michael wasn't there. He was in meetings. Vanessa explained. Very important meetings that couldn't be rescheduled. But I knew the truth. He didn't want to be there. It was easier to let them handle it. to let them place his mother at table 10 with strangers, to let them erase his father's traditions in favor of elegance. I sat through the rest of the brunch in near silence, watching them plan a wedding that had nothing to do with the boy I'd raised and everything to do with the man he thought he needed to become. They discussed flowers that cost more than my monthly mortgage, a band that had played at presidential inaugurations, a menu that required ingredients I couldn't even pronounce. "Don't worry about any of the costs," Meredith said to me at one point, misreading my expression. "Charles and I are happy to handle everything. We know how." Difficult these expenses can be for some people. Some people, like retired teachers, like widows who'd raised their sons on love and casseroles and hand-me-down wisdom. I thought about Richard then, about what he would say if he could see this. He'd built things that lasted, furniture that would outlive us all, a home that sheltered us through every storm, a son who once knew the value of honest work and simple pleasures. Now that son was letting strangers seat his mother at table 10 because she didn't fit the image of the life he was building. "Thank you all for including me," I said when the brunch finally ended, the lie bitter on my tongue. "I'm sure it will be a beautiful wedding." "It will be perfect," Vanessa assured me, squeezing my hand with her manicured fingers. "And Eleanor, if the cost of a dress is a concern, I know a lovely consignment shop, very discreet." I smiled and thanked her. This woman who would be my daughter-in-law, who thought so little of me that she assumed I'd need charity to dress appropriately for my son's wedding. I walked to my car with my head high, but inside, something had shifted, hardened, crystallized into a decision I didn't even realize I'd made. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out the lottery ticket I'd kept all these years, proof of my secret, my test, my foolish hope that love could exist without conditions. I thought about table 10, about discreet consignment shops, about the angle for photographs. And I thought about Richard's last words to me. Make sure he remembers what matters, Ellie. I'd failed at that, but perhaps it wasn't too late to remind him. The wedding day arrived like a perfectly orchestrated symphony, every note planned and paid for by the Callaways. The Rainbow Room glittered 65 floors above Manhattan, offering views that stretched to the horizon. It was the kind of venue that whispered money in every crystal glass, every gold leaf detail, every precisely arranged orchid. I arrived alone, having declined Vanessa's offer to arrange transportation for me. My dress wasn't from a consignment shop. It was new, elegant in its simplicity, purchased with cash from a department store where no one knew my name. I looked appropriate, respectable, invisible, exactly what they expected. An usher I'd never met escorted me to my seat at table 10. So far from the altar I could barely make out the floral arrangements. My table mates were already there, wives of Charles's business associates, women who smiled politely and immediately returned to their conversations about vacation homes and boarding schools. I was a stranger at my own son's wedding. The ceremony itself was beautiful in that sterile way expensive things often are. Vanessa floated down the aisle in a dress that cost more than most people's cars, her smile camera ready, every hair in place. Michael waited at the altar looking handsome and successful, and like someone I barely recognized. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, I held my tongue. What would I say? That I objected to being erased from my son's life? That I objected to being seated with strangers while the Callaway family filled the front rows? That I objected to watching my son marry someone who saw me as an embarrassment to be managed? The vows were perfectly written, probably by the same consultant who'd planned the seating chart, nothing personal. Nothing that might reveal the Michael I'd raised, just elegant words about partnership and success and building a future together. Not one mention of love that lasts through sickness and health, wealth and poverty. These people didn't believe in poverty. The reception began with champagne that probably cost more per bottle than I'd spent on Michael's entire 5th birthday party. I sat at table 10, watching the receiving line from a distance, waiting my turn to congratulate my son. When I finally reached them, Vanessa air-kissed me again, murmuring something about how lovely I looked. Michael hugged me briefly, distracted, already looking past me to the next guest. "I'm so happy for you," I told him, and in that moment, I realized it was a lie. I wasn't happy. I was heartbroken. Dinner was served in courses I couldn't pronounce, tiny portions on enormous plates, the kind of food that left you hungry and impressed. The women at my table discussed their children's accomplishments, their husbands' promotions, their plans to winter in Aspen. When they asked what I did, I told them I was retired. They didn't ask from what. The speeches began after the third course. Charles Calloway spoke about welcoming Michael into their family, about how impressed he was with this young man's drive and ambition. "He's going places," Charles said, raising his glass. "The kind of man who understands what it takes to succeed in this world." Meredith spoke about Vanessa finding her perfect match, someone who appreciated the finer things, who could give her the life she deserved. Vanessa's sister told charming stories about their childhood in the Hamptons. The best man, one of Michael's colleagues, made jokes about merger and acquisition that had the Calloway side roaring with laughter. Then it was Michael's turn. He stood, confident in his designer tuxedo, and began to speak. He thanked Charles and Meredith for welcoming him, for this incredible wedding, for showing him what success looked like. He thanked his groomsmen, his colleagues who'd become brothers. He told Vanessa she'd made him the luckiest man alive, that she'd opened his eyes to possibilities he'd never imagined. He talked for 10 minutes. He thanked everyone who'd helped him become the man he was today. He never mentioned me, not once. He never mentioned Richard. It was as if we'd never existed, as if he'd sprung fully formed into this glittering world. No history, no struggle, no parents who'd sacrificed and saved and loved him into being. I sat at table 10, surrounded by strangers, and felt something inside me break, not crack, not chip, but shatter completely. 23 years of keeping a secret, of waiting for the right moment, of hoping my son would remember what mattered. And here was my answer. I didn't matter. His father didn't matter. We were the prologue he'd rather forget in the story of his success. The music started, the band that had played for presidents striking up something smooth and sophisticated. Michael and Vanessa took the floor for their first dance, and they were perfect together. Two beautiful, successful people who believed the world began and ended in rooms like this. I watched them dance, watched the Callaways beam with pride, watched the photographer capture every angle. No one would notice the woman at table 10, the retired teacher who'd raised the groom. In the official story of this wedding, I was barely a footnote. But I had one more chapter to write. I reached into my purse and touched the envelope I'd brought, the one containing the truth about Eleanor Brooks. Not the whole truth, that would come later, but enough truth to shatter this carefully constructed illusion. The music swelled, the beautiful people danced, and I made my decision. Richard had asked me to make sure Michael remembered what mattered. I'd failed at that, but perhaps I could remind him of what he'd chosen to forget. I stood up from table 10, smoothed my simple dress, and began walking toward the microphone. The walk from table 10 to the microphone felt like crossing an ocean. Conversations quieted as I passed, heads turning to watch this unexpected development, the band, sensing something shifting in the room's atmosphere. Let their song fade to silence. "Excuse me," I said quietly to the band leader. "I'd like to say a few words." He looked confused. I wasn't on the program, but something in my expression must have convinced him. He stepped aside. I stood at the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces. The Callaways at their premium tables, already frowning at this breach of protocol. Michael and Vanessa, frozen in the middle of the dance floor, her hand still on his shoulder. The guests from table 10, probably relieved to have their odd table mate elsewhere. "Good evening," I began, my teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. "For those who don't know me, I'm Eleanor Brooks. Michael's mother. A ripple of surprise. Apparently, many didn't know Michael had a mother in attendance. I wasn't scheduled to speak tonight, I continued. In fact, I wasn't scheduled for much of anything, but there are some things that need to be said, and since no one else seems inclined to say them, I suppose it falls to me. Meredith Calloway was half standing, looking like she wanted to intervene. Charles put a hand on her arm, probably calculating whether making a scene would be worse than letting me continue. 23 years ago, I said, I won the lottery. Michael's face went white. Vanessa's perfect composure cracked, just for a moment. $120 million, I continued, letting the number hang in the air like an uninvited guest. After taxes, still more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, and for 23 years, I've told no one, not my late husband, not my son, no one. The silence was absolute now. Even the waitstaff had frozen, champagne bottles suspended mid-pour. You might wonder why, I said, looking directly at Michael. Why would a widow, a teacher, a woman shopping with coupons and driving a 15-year-old Honda keep such a secret? I'll tell you why. Because I wanted to know who would value me for me. Just Eleanor. Not Eleanor with money. Not Eleanor who could buy her way into acceptance. I saw understanding dawn on faces throughout the room. The Calloways looked like they'd swallowed something bitter. I watched my son grow up, go to college, build his career. I watched him drift away, becoming someone who spoke in stock options and merger deals. I kept thinking, when he gets married, when he starts his own family, I'll tell him. I'll give him and his bride a real start in life. My voice caught slightly, but I pushed on. But then I met Vanessa and her family, and I learned that, in their world, I was something to be tolerated, managed, seated at table 10 with strangers because a retired teacher didn't fit the image. I was offered consignment shops for dresses and charity for expenses I couldn't possibly afford. Mom, Michael started, but I held up my hand. I sat through brunches where my suggestions were dismissed as quaint. I attended dinners where I was a curiosity, a backstory to overcome. I watched my son introduce me with apologies in his voice, watched him erase his father from his history because a carpenter didn't sound impressive enough for the Calloways. Tears were running down my face now, but my voice remained steady. And tonight, I said, I sat at table 10 and listened to my only child thank everyone who made him who he is today. Everyone except the woman who raised him and the man who taught him to ride a bike. We didn't make the cut. Apparently, we weren't elegant enough, successful enough, rich enough. I pulled the envelope from my purse, holding it up. This contains account statements, proof of what I'm telling you. $120 million, sitting in investments, growing quietly while I lived my small life and waited to see if love could exist without conditions. I looked at Michael, my son, my heartbreak. I learned tonight that it can't, at least not here, not in this room full of people who judge worth by net worth. I set the envelope on the nearest table. So, I'll keep my money, all of it. It won't go to fund a life built on appearances and seating charts and the proper angle for photographs. It won't validate a world where mothers are afterthoughts and fathers are erased and love comes with income requirements. The room erupted in whispers, but I wasn't finished. Michael, I said, looking directly at my son, your father would have been so proud of the boy you were. The man you've become? I shook my head. He wouldn't recognize you, and honestly, neither do I. I stepped away from the microphone, my simple shoes clicking on the polished floor. The crowd parted as I walked through it, their shocked faces a blur. I didn't stop at table 10 to collect my things. I didn't say goodbye to my table mates or thank the hosts or follow any of the protocols that mattered so much in this glittering world. I simply walked out, leaving behind the account statements, the wedding I'd been excluded from, and the son who'd forgotten where he came from. Behind me, I heard Michael calling, "Mom, Mom, wait!" But I didn't stop. I'd waited 23 years. I was done waiting. The elevator doors closed on the chaos I'd left behind, carrying me down from the 65th floor. away from the crystal and gold and carefully orchestrated perfection. By the time I reached the street, I felt lighter than I had in years. The doorman offered to call me a taxi, but I shook my head. It was a beautiful night, and I had nowhere urgent to be. Just a widow with a secret finally told, walking through Manhattan in my simple dress, every step taking me further from table 10 and closer to whatever came next. The Manhattan streets were quiet for a Saturday night. Or maybe I just couldn't hear the noise over the ringing in my ears. I walked for blocks, my sensible shoes carrying me away from the Rainbow Room and everything it represented. My phone buzzed incessantly in my purse. Michael, no doubt. Or perhaps Vanessa demanding an explanation for the scene I'd caused. I didn't check. It wasn't until I reached the parking garage that I heard the footsteps running behind me. Mom, please wait!" I turned. Michael stood there in his perfect tuxedo, breathing hard, his carefully styled hair now disheveled. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and stories about his day. "Mom," he said again, and his voice cracked. "Is it true? The money?" "Every word," I said simply. "Why didn't you tell me?" I almost laughed. Would it have mattered? Would you have treated me differently if you'd known? That's not fair, isn't it? I cut him off. Tell me, Michael, if you'd known about the money, would I still have been seated at table 10? Would Vanessa still have suggested consignment shops? Would you have remembered to mention your father and me in your speech? He was crying now, the successful man in his designer tuxedo, tears streaming down his face. "I got lost," he whispered. "I know that. I got so caught up in their world, in being someone who belonged there." "You always belonged," I said softly. "Just not to me. Not anymore." "Mom, please, is it too late? Can we fix this?" I looked at my son, really looked at him. Beneath the expensive suit and practiced smile, I could still see traces of the boy Richard and I had raised, but traces weren't enough. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe someday. When you remember who you are without the Callaways telling you. When you can introduce me without apology. When you can talk about your father with pride instead of silence." "I want to try," he said. "Please." I reached up and touched his face, this child I'd carried and raised and lost to a world that measured worth in dollars. "Then try," I said, "but not tonight. Tonight, you have a wedding to return to, a wife to explain to, in-laws to appease. That's the life you chose." "What about the money?" he asked. And I saw Vanessa's influence even in this moment of crisis, still thinking about the fortune that had slipped through his fingers. "It'll do what it was always meant to do," I said. "Help people who need it. Scholarships for kids who think education is out of reach. Libraries that believe in the power of stories. Community centers where fathers teach their children to build things with their hands. Real things, lasting things." "That could have been mine," he said, and the honesty of his greed was almost refreshing. "No," I corrected him. "It could have been yours if you'd been mine, but you chose to be theirs." I turned to go, but his hand on my arm stopped me. "Mom," he said, "what if I don't want to be theirs anymore?" I looked back at him, this man who was my son but felt like a stranger. "Then you know where to find me," I said. "Same house, same garden, same life you were so eager to leave behind. But Michael, don't come back because of the money. It won't be there. Come back because you remember what mattered before you knew it existed." I pulled my arm free and walked to my car. In the rearview mirror, I could see him standing there, a solitary figure in a tuxedo, caught between the world he'd chosen and the one he'd abandoned. The drive home was peaceful. I played the oldies station Richard had loved, windows down, breathing in the night air. By the time I reached Mapleford, the sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that no amount of money could improve upon. I parked in my driveway, beside the garden where Richard had taught Michael to plant tomatoes. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Small, outdated, perfect, inside. The answering machine blinked with 17 messages. I unplugged it. Later that morning, I called my lawyer, the one from 3 states away who'd helped me keep my secret all these years. I want to establish a foundation, I told him, for education, for libraries, for preserving the trades, for all the things that matter but don't glitter. All of it, he asked. Every penny. I confirmed. I've seen what it does to people. I won't let it sit there anymore, waiting for hearts that have forgotten how to be grateful. By noon, I was back in my garden, hands in the soil, planting the fall vegetables. The neighbor's cat wandered over, seeking attention, somewhere in Manhattan. The Calloway wedding was probably continuing into a lavish brunch, with stories already spinning about the crazy mother and her lottery tale. Let them talk. Let them wonder. Let them count their money and their connections and their place settings. I had tomatoes to plant, library volunteers to meet, a life to live, a small life, perhaps, an insignificant life by the Calloway's standards. But mine. The phone rang inside. I didn't answer it. If Michael truly wanted to find his way home, he'd have to do more than call. He'd have to remember who he was before the world taught him to be someone else. I pressed my hands deeper into the earth, feeling its warmth, its promise. Richard would have understood. He always did. Did I do the right thing? I asked the sky, the garden, the memory of my husband. The wind chimed through the trees he'd planted, and I had my answer. For the first time in 23 years, I felt truly rich. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with each other. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Eleanor's place? Let me know what you think.